Welcome to Burgernomics, demystifying economics with Ross MacDowell.
Hi everybody, I'm Ross MacDowell and welcome to the Burgernomics podcast, where Australia's leading experts and I demystify economic topics that affect you. Today's discussion is Australia's housing price boom. When will it bust? If you're in the minority of Australians who don't own a home but are saving for one, should you scramble to buy a home or wait, hoping for a price downturn? If you own your own home, how long will the price party last? My guest today is Brendan Coates, the Economic Policy Program Director for the Grattan Institute, Australia's most respected independent policy think tank. Brendan Coates co-authored with John Daley a landmark study entitled Housing Affordability, Reimagining the Australian Dream. If you need an unbiased view of housing, Brendan is the number one person in Australia to demystify the housing market. In our conversation, Brendan encapsulates the roles of the banks, regulators, right down to the local council planning man sitting at his desk in a cardigan. For homeowners and prospective owners, Brendan gives us a riveting masterclass in Australian housing. In fact, Brendan knows so much about housing and is so enthusiastic about his topic, even I struggle to interrupt him. I just wanted to keep him talking. We had such a great conversation, my talented editor Oscar insisted he make it a double episode. You will be genuinely fascinated with what you're about to hear. Welcome to Burgernomics, Brendan. Housing booms, do they always end in a bust, is what we're going to talk about today. And in demystifying the Australian housing market, you and I are going to cover a smorgasbord of topics in today's Burgernomics podcast. But first of all, before we delve into some of those economic topics of our current housing situation, you firmly believe that any discussion regarding housing needs to have a definition of housing to give meaning to any discussion. So please tell us the definition of housing from where you're coming from.
Thanks, Ross, and thanks for having me on the podcast. You know, my experience of talking about these issues the last few years is people often talk about issues around housing without really defining what they're talking about. And it makes it really hard to kind of understand the drivers, because housing is unique in Australia amongst other sort of goods and services for a couple of reasons. One, you know, housing is an asset, you know, so it's something that we both live in and something that we own. And therefore, it's not just about, you know, thinking about housing as, you know, the way that we think about other goods and services. You also got to think about it as an asset. And people access housing in two different ways. There's the market for renting housing, which is really, you know, that's the pure market for, you know, if you want to access a place to live, you know, what do you have to pay? Well, you have to pay rent. And so, you know, the rent is what you pay in order to get access to that house. And so that's the price of having a house that you can live in, the price of consuming housing. But we also have this other market in Australia, as we do in many countries, which is the price of owning housing. And that's, in a lot of cases, people are owning a house that they then choose to live in themselves. And the benefit they get from that is not having to pay rent. But it means that there's these two different markets. So the way to really think about it is the price of like accessing a house is rent. And that's kind of driven broadly by, you know, the demand and supply of in the stock of housing, the relative demand and supply of the stock.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, things like immigration, you know, things like the rate of new building supply, construction, these things affect like that underlying, you know, demand and supply of housing. But then you also have this extra level on top, which we talked about, which is the fact that people buy a house. And it's kind of like, you know, your show's called Burgernomics, and we'll talk more about that later. Like renting is kind of like going into Macca's and buying a burger. What's the cost of getting the burger that you then get to eat? Owning a house is kind of like, okay, I want to go buy a McDonald's, you know, and so that's affected by both the price that McDonald's sells the burgers at versus its costs. But it's also affected by things like the fact that you normally, if you're going to buy one of those, like a McDonald's, you're probably going to borrow money in order to go and buy it. Mm-hmm. And so access to credit and the interest rate that you pay have big impacts on the price of the McDonald's but they don't really affect the price of the burger very much that you're actually buying if you walk into a Macca's today and eat one. And so it's the same with housing. Housing that you own is something where it's driven by the price of housing is driven by the underlying demand and supply in the stock of housing, but it's also driven by borrowing costs and driven by interest rates, particularly in the short term.
So if we were to look at the laws of supply and demand, applying them to the Australian housing market, and if I all of a sudden became the father of economics, Adam Smith, and took myself back to 1776 when he developed the laws of supply and demand, he would say that we've got a whole bunch of people out there that want houses to purchase, and they're bidding up the price of those houses. And then Adam Smith would say, the property developers would go, wow, this is fantastic. We've got all these people who want these houses. Here's profit just sitting there waiting to happen. We will just build a whole lot of houses and we'll make lots of money. And eventually all the people that want to buy the houses that are creating the demand, they would become smaller and smaller in number as they were purchasing the houses being built for them by the property developers. And then eventually the market would reach equilibrium or would soften a lot because the demand has fallen, prices wouldn't be going up as much, and so there would be a stabilisation of prices in the housing market. Now, for 25 years, that doesn't seem to be happening because all we've seen is prices going up, 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 and we would appear that the supply side is not able to quench the thirst of the buyers. Why isn't the laws of supply and demand functioning efficiently in the $9.1 trillion housing market? What's going on?
Thanks, Ross. I think 1.9 trillion is probably where it was at in the early 1990s. But yeah, it's gone.
1.9 trillion is actually the amount of mortgages that underwrite the $9.1 trillion market. Anyway.
We are talking about, I remember giving these presentations a couple of years ago where it was a $7 trillion housing market. So things can change quickly. Yeah. So it's worth stepping back and kind of going, okay, so can you explain what's happening in housing markets today using, economics? And I think the short answer is you broadly can. And it comes back to what we talked about before. There's a market for owning a house, and then there's, the underlying demand and supply for physical housing, which is the rental market gives you a better linked sign of. And so what's happened in the last 20 years is that we've deregulated the financial system. Interest rates have fallen from, 7 and 18%. We're back in Paul Keating's day, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, yes, to really low rates. And so rates have come down a lot. Now, that means demand for housing goes up a lot. We only add a little bit to the stock of housing every year. So, we only add 1.5%, maybe 2% to the dwelling stock a year. So you will inevitably see prices rise ahead of supply in a world where even if supply was working well. Now, what we've also had, though, is that we probably haven't, I think it's pretty clear we haven't built enough housing over the last 25 years to meet that increase in population. So average household size, so the number of people that live in each dwelling in Australia, was steadily declining through the 80s, 90s as we got wealthier. People, frankly, don't want to live with as many other people. They're happy, as a wealthier society, you can afford for your kids to theoretically could move out earlier. You have more space per person. And that basically stopped. That's flatlined. And so Australia is one of the few countries in the world that's basically built very few. Our housing per adult is the same now as what it was 20 years ago, whereas other countries like Japan have 20% more housing per adult now than they had 20 years ago. So a lot of that's about the planning system, because if you want to build a house as a developer or build a 10-story apartment building, what you have to do is you have to get planning permission. Planning permission is about making sure that, land uses that are next door to each other don't affect each other. So you don't build like an abattoir, which has a horrible smell, next to a school or next to an apartment building. Right. But where we've ended up is those problems around the planning system, which is really about how local councils make decisions, and local councils reflect the interests of those that live there now. It means that it's very restrictive in order to be able to build more housing, particularly in the inner middle ring suburbs of our major cities. Density is barely increased outside the CBD of Melbourne. And it's increased a bit in recent years around train stations in Sydney. But beyond that, where there's opportunities for profit for developers that they can't take advantage of because we make it hard to build the amount of housing we probably need.
So you're saying there is an artificial limit to supply directly linked to the planning departments of local council. Are you saying that they are inefficient, misguided? Why? What's their motivation for not wanting to make Australia a far better place to live and assist people with housing? What's their motivation for wanting to create this limitation?
It's a failure of political economy, Ross. So the issue is, in most cases, local councils reflect the interests of who lives there now. That's who gets to vote in council elections. People who would move to an area, particularly this is a bigger problem in the leafier, nicer areas of our major cities that are already well served by infrastructure, southeast of Melbourne, the northern eastern suburbs of Sydney. That people who would move into an area if more housing is built, they don't get a vote. And you can see that in the some situations where we've made greater progress are in Sydney now. They've moved away for medium density developments. So, 5-story apartment buildings, they're no longer running through the local councils. They're running through these independent planning panels that were set up to get developer corruption out of the process. And you've seen a lot more housing. In Brisbane, you have one city council that represents the majority of the metropolitan area of Brisbane. And as a result, they are the one jurisdiction that built a lot of apartments on sort of around the river. And that actually saw rents fall. And rents have also fell in Sydney before COVID because they allowed more housing to be built. So it's a problem of political economy and representation and essentially power. Because the benefits of migration and population growth accrue to the community as a whole, but each council says, no, I don't want them here. Put them somewhere else. And the net effect is we don't build enough housing. They end up living a lot more on the urban fringe, and housing costs are higher than they probably should be.
Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of people screaming unaffordability. We've got councils not wanting to issue permits to developers that are screaming, I want to build houses and make a profit. That's altering our laws of supply and demand, not to create an efficient market. Let me put this to you in regard to that law of supply and demand not working. We've got state governments who are in charge of local councils raking in the cash through stamp duty. So an increasing housing market in terms of price suits them. We've got a federal government. It's got record low interest rates, low inflation. We've got homeowners with their houses endlessly climbing in value, and that causes the wealth effect, which we're going to talk about in a later podcast, but it basically says that they feel good and so they will spend money on other things, cars and hamburgers. The demand for housing keeps a whole lot of tradies employed. Together with the consumption, because people are feeling wealthy, we've got near full employment. So really, if I'm a federal government, I'm in Disneyland. This is Fantasyland. We've still got this group of people that are screaming blue murder, housing affordability, I can't afford it. But if I was the federal government, I would see that as probably acceptable collateral damage to have the economy in the state that it's currently in. So is there really an impetus anywhere in the system to correct this, the laws of supply and demand that seem to have been gotten out of kilter?
So, we've talked about supply being one of the problems. The other problem is obviously on the demand side, it's the tax setting. So it takes both a demand, prices and rents are set where demand meets supply. So you've got to think about both. So there are problems on the supply side, which are a state responsibility. There are problems on the demand side, which are much more a Commonwealth responsibility. They control the tax system. So the tax concessions available for investors through negative gearing, but particularly the capital gains tax discount, the fact that family home is exempt from the age pension assets test, the fact that owner-occupied housing itself, if you live in your own home, you never pay tax on the capital gains. And that's a huge increase in wealth that people have experienced in recent years. And our numbers, if you did everything on the supply side and you built 50,000 more homes for a decade, then prices and rents would fall 10 to 20% from where they are gradually. If you did everything on the tax side, we think prices would fall maybe 10%. That's kind of the value of those tax concessions relative to the size of the housing market, like actually what they're worth.
Okay.
Now, all those policies are difficult. Planning at the state level means taking on constituencies that are often marginal seats, or in some cases the heartland, particularly for the coalition in Melbourne and Sydney. Taking on the tax side, we had a whole election in 2019 about negative gearing and capital gains tax discount. We don't think it costs Labor government. The seats that swung towards the coalition were actually low-income areas, and the seats that swung towards Labor were high-income areas that would have been most affected. It's seen now as not being very effective, or it's seen now as a bridge too far, at least unless Labor form government, and then who knows what happens. So the challenge there is, as you put it, there are, several million homeowners in Australia, and 100,000 people buy a house for the first time each year. And so the economics and the politics are certainly such that, it favours most people own their own home and therefore are happy with house prices to rise. The way in which this is going to play out, I think, on the politics is that, people are seeing that their kids and their grandkids can't get into the market, and they can't get into the market near where they live. So families are being broken up because they can't. The way that families are dealing with this is they're giving money to their kids so that they can afford a house with a deposit that's near them. And that's ultimately, if anything's going to change, that's what's going to change. A premise of your question, though, Ross, was that this is good economics almost, that, it's in the economy's interest that housing's unaffordable. I don't think that's not sure quite what you meant, but I would certainly think that that's not the case. So there's really good research out of the US that says that, if you boosted on the supply side by fixing the planning system, US GDP would rise 5 to 10%. Because basically people could live closer to their jobs. They could move to take on new opportunities. I think the effects would be smaller in Australia because we have 2 or 3 or 4 big cities, depending on your definition. Whereas in the US, it's people would move from the Midwest, industrial Midwest, into San Francisco. And that's what they can't do now.
But in the US, they've had housing. The last 12 months, they've had up to 34% increase in housing values. They're suffering. Everyone's suffering the same sort of situation worldwide. And
that's right.
The premise that I get back to is that currently everybody wants to the people that can't afford want to allocate blame, if you like, to the banks or to quantitative easing, or they've got a whole range of things. But really what you're saying is it's a political decision whether or not to increase the supply of housing. And maybe there's some political factors that say they don't want to, or it doesn't suit them, or they might lose some seats. And so maybe it's not so much the housing question, it's another political question.
Ultimately, this is about politics. So if you look in the last 2 years, kind of what's driven the boom we've seen, look, it's low interest rates. The Reserve Bank published a paper in 2019 of Model of the Housing Market. It's called A Model of the Australian Housing Market by Trent Saunders and Peter Tulip. If you would use that paper as the basis for your understanding of what's happened since COVID, it makes perfect sense. So what they said is that if you cut interest rates by a percentage point from already low levels, and that cut's seen as being fairly permanent, house prices rise by 25%. That is literally what we've seen since the onset of COVID. Because prices, when rates are that low, you reduced your borrowing interest payments. If your interest rate goes from 3.5% to 2.5%, then you can borrow, up to 30%, 20, 30% more. And that's what people do. And I think it's unlikely rates are going to rise anytime soon. I think globally, as a whole conversation you could have about secular stagnation, the fact that interest rates are low around the world and are likely to stay that way. But that's the global dimension that has allowed prices to rise or seen prices rise in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. The story is the same across all of these countries. The difference was over the long term in the 1950s and 60s, we saw a similar effect. Access to credit, low rates, so on and so forth. And it saw a building boom rather than just bidding up the prices of assets. And that's what's different this time around, is that construction is strong relative to history, but migration's also really strong relative to history, like in the pre-COVID world. And so if you want to see, interest rates should have the effect of boosting prices, and instead boosting construction. And instead what they've done is they've boosted prices, and there's not a great sign that you're going to see a big construction boom coming down the path.
Well, with 300,000 migrants not being able to come into the country at the moment, which was our yearly intake, those migrants, I would presume, would come into the country if they were allowed, and they would rent rather than they would buy. And so that gets into the investor market to be able to satisfy the demand for their renting. Again, you're saying these planning restrictions are capping the ability to supply even the migrants coming into the country, which then flows through everywhere else.
That's right. So you've kind of, as I said, you've got these two markets, a market for renting and a market for owning. So what that means is if someone comes into the market as a renter, they're adding to the physical demand for housing, right? And so rents will rise if there's no supply response. And that same RBA paper I just talked about said basically that since 2005 is when we saw a big lift up in migration. If that lift up in migration hadn't have happened, then by 2018, rents would have been 9% lower than they were in 2018, which by extension means prices would have been 9% lower. So migration, has lots of benefits, and we're a supporter of migration generally, but it does have an effect on housing affordability given that supply is constrained. Now, you take out 300,000 people due to COVID, that probably means rents fall or are lower than otherwise by 3 or 4%. Now, obviously, there's other effects happening in COVID. Like I'm recording this with you from my office at home. We're looking to buy a new house, literally because of COVID. And so Australians have also increased their demand for housing because they're after bigger houses. And so that's almost offset the effect on rents and prices from migration, because you've got 10 million Australians increasing their demand for housing versus 300,000 migrants who aren't here.
Right.
Those effects, how that nets out is an interesting question.
So, okay, let's talk about COVID for a second. There seems to be pressures both on price, both for and against increases in price due to COVID. I mean, after each lockdown in Melbourne and Sydney, there's pent-up demand. People go wild and start buying houses. This previous weekend, we've seen the auction market go wild with a huge clearance rate. So you would say that pent-up demand puts pressure on prices. But then, as we've just said, you've got migration. You've got 300,000 people not appearing at the front, knocking on the front door for housing. So I would imagine that takes pressure off the need for housing. Then you've got another thing that might reduce the pressure in housing, the acceptance of remote working. All of a sudden, the people are supposedly, if we read the newspaper reports, they're happy to leave the city and go and buy rural property somewhere. I would have thought then if you have people evacuating from CBD areas or inner city areas to provincial areas, that takes the pressure off housing. But then if people are at home and if Melbourne, there's curfew, etc., there's no restaurants, household savings goes up because they can't spend their money on anything. And so if they're going to save more money, they'll have more money for a home deposit, and therefore they can borrow more money. And then when they come out of lockdown, that puts pressure on housing on an upward way because they've got more money to spend. There seems to be so many conflicting pressures that COVID has created in the Australian housing market. Which pressures do you think ride out? I mean, a lot of people go, wow, we've seen this demand, it's come out of the blocks, it's flying, but we don't expect it to continue, it'll peter out. Or people scared that, oh my God, the demand may not be there in 6 months' time. I've got a house to sell. I want to do it now. Let's hurry up. And then that supply pressure puts price pressures down. What do you think wins out?
Well, I think in the short term, what we've seen is that you've kind of had things moving, as you say, in opposite directions. And again, I'd recommend that RBA paper I mentioned, because I think it does the best job of setting out the long-term relationships and the short-term ones. In the short term, if you think about what's going to affect house prices, it's interest rates and access to credit. They are the two biggest factors that drive prices in the short term. And as we talked about before, like even a modest interest rate fall, because rates are already so low, has an enormous effect on repayments and therefore your borrowing capacity. So, the best indicator of prices is typically, growth in new lending commitments that are coming out, because it's telling you how much people are borrowing, and that tends to lead house prices by a couple of months. Mm-hmm. So in the current market, you've had a decline in rents because of migration. You've had a larger decline in rents in the inner city because people have, one, migrants go to the cities, and two, people have moved to the country, which has actually reduced rents more in the inner areas and seen increased rents in regional areas, particularly regional New South Wales. Those effects exist, but they're just swamped by interest rates in the short term. And access to credit. So in the short term, if you're thinking of like buying or selling a house, look at mortgage repayments and look at, mortgage lending and look at interest rates and what's going to happen over the course of the next 2 years. And that's your best guide. As a policymaker, I don't want to see higher interest rates to reduce prices, because that has a whole bunch of other very costly effects. It means higher unemployment. It has a whole bunch of effects that are very hurtful. It's slower wages growth, has hurtful effects on all Australians. So in the long term, you are talking about supply and demand, those policy levers. But if you're thinking about when the hell do I sell my house or buy one, the credit story is probably the main thing for people.
Okay. Now, I want to get to interest rates, the credit story, and some of those things just in a short time. But before we do that, I'd love to discuss with you the famed smashed avocado effect. Now, this is the effect put forward by the famed Bernard Salt, who's a demographer and writes for the Weekend Australian. And he basically is saying that we have an age group that want to buy houses, but they also want to live a lifestyle as depicted by social media. And they're finding it difficult to save the right amount of money for the house that they want to buy, because they're paying $32.50 for a smashed avocado at breakfast at their local cafe, and that may be preventing them from getting what they want. Now, I've got a slightly different take on the smashed avocado effect that I'd like to put to you for your comment. We've got all these different generations. We've got the silent generation, we've got the post-war baby boomers and the millennials. Now, if I think about my father, he was in the silent generation. He came home from war. The government provided him with a war service loan. And like many Australians, he went and built a house to have his 3 children, 2.8 children, whatever the average number of children everyone had in the 1950s. And his criteria for buying a house, as were basically everybody's then, was, I have this amount of money. I go to the bank and I say, I've got my war service loan. This is my job. This is how much I earn. They lend him amount of money. He knows what he's got to spend on purchasing a home. He then goes and finds something he can afford. And in those days, that would mean you just keep on going out and out from the CBD in terms of the suburbs until you hit the suburb that you liked the most that you could afford. You didn't say, well, I was brought up in, let's say in Melbourne, in South Yarra. I need to, as my father was, I have to buy in South Yarra. The bank's not lending me enough money for me to buy where I grew up. This is not right. That's where my social infrastructure is. It's also closer to where I work in the city where he worked. And so he didn't have that attitude. He represented a common attitude at the time, and he just kept on moving out and bought land in a market garden that was being turned into a housing estate, and he built a house, and everybody lived happily ever after. The smashed avocado effect and the age group within that, they seem to be saying, my buying criteria is completely inflexible. And if I can't buy where I want to buy, I'm not buying at all, and I don't think this is fair. What do you feel about the silent generation and the mobility of housing purchasing and the smashed avocado effect?
Yeah, Ross, there's a lot in that. So let's unpack it. So first of all, okay, like what are the constraints to buying a house? There's normally three. Can I save the deposit? Can I afford to service the mortgage repayments? And then there's a third one, which is increasingly important, is am I comfortable with the level of risk that I'm taking on, particularly with rates at low levels, right? And the prospect that they may rise in future. And they'll probably rise from where we are today. The question is kind of when. So the serviceability is pretty easy. Like if I won't go to a bank, I can get a loan for a lot of money. The challenge is always, can I afford the deposit? And so what's happened is, as house prices used to be 2 or 3 times annual incomes back in, say, the early 1980s, early 1990s, now they're 5, 6, 7 in Sydney and Melbourne, 10, 12 times annual incomes. So, that's one thing that has changed, is it takes a lot longer to accumulate that deposit. Now, we did a study a while ago on different spending patterns of different generations. And what's really interesting is younger generations actually spend less on discretionary items today than what older generations did 20 years ago. The difference is, and I think this is a source of the Bernard Salt meme, or the idea is, younger Australians are spending money on going out, but they're actually not spending any more than previous generations did. They're just doing it a lot more because it's a lot cheaper. So restaurants are cheaper, clothes are cheaper. A lot of things that old generations that saw as being expensive, like I remember growing up and school uniforms cost an absolute bomb because they weren't made in China. Whereas now they are. They were made in so they previously were made in a factory in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Now they're made in China for 1/5 of the price. And so younger generations are actually saving more now than what their parents did, 20, 30 years ago. So that's probably one where I'd sit on the side of the younger gen. It's not smashed avocados. That the average person, the average young person, is spending less on discretionary items than they did 20 years ago. Okay. They're saving more. They're spending more on essentials, including housing. The other part of it is the deposit takes a lot longer. So the deposit's the hurdle. So if you haven't got access to the bank of mum and dad, that's who's struggling. If you've got access to the bank of mum and dad and they can chip in 50, 100 grand at some point to help you, then people are accessing the market because the repayments are quite low. Even if the mortgage is enormous, the repayments are relatively low. It's getting the deposit together. And what we see is, back in the 1980s, early 1980s, if you break young Australians up into sort of 5 quadrants. So the wealthiest 20%, the second 20% through to the poorest 20%. The wealthiest 3 quadrants are all still buying houses. And they're buying them a little bit later because the deposit takes longer. So they're often buying in their 30s rather than in their 20s. They're getting married later, they're doing all that stuff. It's the poorest 2 quadrants that aren't buying. So I don't think this is a preference thing where people are kind of going, no, I want to be near where my parents are or whatever. I think it's like they literally just can't get the deposit together to buy because the deposit is now 10 times their annual income when it used to be 4 or 5. That said as well, Melbourne's a larger place. My father-in-law lives in the outer suburbs of Melbourne and he used to commute to the city, CBD every day by car. And it used to take him half an hour. That same trip now would take him over an hour. So the city gets bigger. It's harder. So, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of kind of saying, well, look, older gens had 17% interest rates. And that was hard. And I'm sure it was. If you bought a house where the interest rate was 9%, then it goes to 17%, that would have been a horrible experience. If you got through it, then you had the run up where as interest rates fell from 17% now to 0.1%, then your house prices exploded in value. You've had a great run because you thought you'd be paying a lot of money on your mortgage repayments and now you're paying less. So that's kind of, I suppose, where we sit on the sort of the generational divide. It is actually harder. I think objectively it is more difficult. That doesn't mean that some people aren't setting their expectations high and possibly unreasonably so. I think the solution there is younger generations in particular, you ask them, are they willing to be in do they want a freestanding house? Like, if you want a freestanding house in South Yarra, good luck to you. You're going to have a pretty good income and a pretty good life to do that. The most likely way someone's going to get a freestanding house in South Yarra is if they inherit it from their parents. But, could you have a set of townhouses or a 5-story apartment building? What we find in our surveys is most people don't want the suburban quarter-acre block. A majority actually want, or close to a majority actually want, a townhouse or an apartment close to transport and therefore close to the city. But they don't get it because the planning system doesn't allow those things to happen because it's too hard to subdivide. It's actually something that's now affecting downsizers. They can't find the housing in the location they grew up in because they, or perhaps more generously their neighbours, have been, petitioning council to oppose those developments over the course of the last 40 years.
So you think that, again, getting back to the councils, the mobility of people's aspirations in owning a house could be solved by council planning permits going, people want to live in Malvern, South Yarra, Vaucluse, Rose Bay, wherever. We should make it easier for them to live in those places by allowing the demolition of the houses that currently exist there, maybe on the quarter-acre blocks, so that we could put 4 or 5 units on that block. That would solve a lot of the problem.
It would certainly help a lot. Now, it's not to say that planning rules, are not a good idea. It is absolutely important that what you choose to do with your land does have effects on your neighbours. So if you build a 10-story, apartment building surrounded by single-family dwellings, that'd be a big shock to the neighbourhood. But at the moment, we've got the balance wrong. The balance is too far to the world of saying no.
So, my fellow Burgernomics, what Brendan is telling us, there are 2 housing markets, renters and owners. House prices continue climbing due to record low interest rates, and property developers can't build enough properties because your local council planning department won't issue enough permits. It was also interesting to learn that the famed smashed avocado effect may be a misnomer. In part 2 of the podcast, Brendan and I discuss how the current housing price boom fits with Australia's history of housing price booms and answer the question, how long will the current boom last? My thanks to today's guest, Brendan Coates, Economic Program Policy Director of the Grattan Institute, my Burgernomics podcast editor, Oscar Yeager, and Ology Creative for providing all of our design visuals. Please subscribe to the Burgernomics podcast on your favourite podcast platform. I'm also very interested to hear your comments, so please leave them on the Burgernomics podcast feed, Twitter, LinkedIn or Instagram.